The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr President, I rise to address the appropriation and other related bills now before the House. Just before I commence addressing the substance, I make the request. I think the bills have been reported in cognate fashion. I request that they be voted upon separately for reasons that those who have been in the House for a number of years would well remember. The appropriation bills properly are not able to be amended or blocked by this House. The other bills, of course, do not fall into that category. Given the behaviours of a past Treasurer, we will request that they be voted upon separately.
I believe in that way.
Mr President, 8 budgets, 4 Treasurers, 3 Premiers, and still this government has not been able to repair the accumulated and massive damage that they and their predecessors have done through the cuts to investment and health, education and other vital services across our state. 8 budgets that they have only just worked out that the community rightly expects that those services which make life worth living must be properly funded by government. This 8th and hopefully final coalition budget reveals clearly that those opposite will continue to put stadiums before schools, hospitals and other vital services that our communities are desperately needing. Mr Deputy President, before I continue, if those opposite want to keep interjecting, I can take every moment of 40 minutes.
No.
Is that how you want to play it, Catherine?
Look, I'll keep the House in order.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. What we have here, Mr Deputy President, is a pre-election budget con job focused on cuts to services, attempting to give the impression of playing catch-up after 8 years or 8 budgets of neglect to the health and education systems of this state. Let's have a look at the state they're leaving the budget in before we head towards the next election. The budget position for this financial year is $600 million down on the half-yearly review. The budget surpluses between 19 and 21 have been written down by nearly $730 million. Those opposite like to try and monster our side of politics with charges of debt and deficit. When last in office, the Labor Party reduced net debt of this state from $15 billion, or 7.1% of gross state product, down to less than $8 billion, or 1.8% of gross state product when we left office. This budget will return gross state net debt as a percentage of gross state product to over 4% over the forward estimates, ratcheting up each year. Net debt in 18-19 will go up to nearly $3 billion and is forecast to be nearly $29 billion by 21-22, despite the fact that the government has privatised or sold off $50 billion worth of public assets. $50 billion worth of privatisations, net debt blowing out to nearly $30 billion. But of course that's net debt, and for the benefit of those who don't know, this is not a mortgage offset account. It's not like you can just sell things, put them in the bank, and that somehow cancels out the debt that has been racked up. Total state sector borrowings is forecast to hit $77.5 billion by 18-19 and nearly $94 billion by 21-22. Again, despite $50 billion of privatisation. And the repayments. The repayments on this debt, because repayments are not made on net debt, but are paid on actual debt, will go up to something like $4.5 billion over the forward estimates per year, from nearly $3.5 billion this year. At the same time, through the privatisations, this government has weakened the balance sheet of the state. In 2012-13, dividends from various sources to the government were $2.6 billion, but in this budget, in 17-18, they were only $1.5 billion. That's a loss of over $1 billion a year in recurrent funding for the state budget. That's $11 billion of revenue over the next decade sacrificed. This has exposed the state to unreliable stamp duties, which we can see some softening in the revenue from. This year's budget confirms that $5.5 billion in stamp duties have been lost over the 19 to 21 period. We can also see that despite now being in its 8th year in office, the coalition government has failed to address the fact that 180,000 new school places are needed in the next 15 years, announcing just 13 new schools, with none of them having a start or a finish date, nor a single dollar of investment next to their name, only a figure of some $417 million for planning over the four years. Of course, those opposite should remember that this government cut the education budget by nearly $2 billion in 2012 and cut $266 million from school capital works. Now, the government has promised a dozen new schools a year, but under there, more schools have closed since 2011 than have opened. The previous Labor government averaged 5 new schools each year. This government has averaged just 2. Our children are sitting in nearly 4,800 demountables that the Minister has confirmed are here to stay. And when we turn to TAFE, what do we see? We see 175,000 fewer students in TAFE. We see course fees put up, TAFE campuses closed. We see all sorts of things done to weaken the system of TAFE, including 5,000 fewer TAFE teachers. This is simply not good enough. What we've also seen is that no construction money has been allocated in the budget to the Sydney Gateway and Rosedale interchange sections of WestConnex, nor for the north-south rail link to the Western Sydney Airport or the second stage of Parramatta Light Rail. This year, only 8.4% of the nearly $33 billion Restart New South Wales Fund went towards health and education. Of the 170 announcements claimed by the government, only 20 of them are in any way new projects, and that is again another example of their attempt to engage in sleight of hand. And let's talk about the air conditioning program for schools. The government has announced a $500 million program, but that's not over the forward estimates. They're only providing $100 million a year, pushing it out beyond the forward estimates. This pales into insignificance with the program already announced by the Labor opposition. $300 million from the Snowy Hydro sale, with the other $500 million to come from consolidated revenue. And when we look at health, we see the same attempts at sleight of hand. The government has promised $582 million for a Tweed hospital, but only $51 million provided in the budget, less than $51 million, and it won't be completed until 2025. The much vaunted Liverpool Health and Academic Precinct, said to be $740 million, only $3.5 million in the budget. Scheduled completion date 2026. Westmead Hospital, $765 million promised, only $188 million in the budget, again not to be finished until 2025. And we see the same pattern with Randwick, Maitland, Camperdown and even the Pean Hospital, with the completion dates pushed out not beyond the election date of next year, but the election date of the end of that parliament. They're making promises to be delivered not by their successors in office, but by their successors' successors. 2 elections away, which means none of these promises can be believed. There are many other areas in which this budget can be critiqued, but I won't delay the House. I'll just make a couple of observations. The best this government can do to help citizens tackle soaring energy prices is to allocate an assistance service through Service New South Wales, when we've heard in a parliamentary inquiry this week that the profit margins alone of the big energy companies constitute 15 to 20% of household energy bills, then the people of New South Wales are in for long cold winters and hot summers because they won't be able to afford the energy. Last year and this year we've heard a lot about instances of wage theft. There's the Wollongong scandal, and even in successive weeks, including last week, there have been reports from the Fair Work Ombudsman right across the state, right across rural and regional New South Wales, scores of instances of not accidental underpayments, but systematic ripping off mainly of young and vulnerable workers, and nothing in the budget to help address this. There are so many shortcomings in this budget. Those opposite and those reading the record of this should not mistake the fact that we will not vote to block the budget, because the convention of this House is that budgets are allowed to pass without much debate, without amendment. But make no mistake, we will, in the days, weeks and months ahead as we lead up to the election, will be unravelling this very poor budget which delivers very little for the people of the state.